Section 9. If no one is watching, would you still want this life? There is a question that doesn't appear when you're busy. It doesn't come when you're chasing work, meeting targets, responding to messages one after another. When you're busy, everything has a reason. There's something to do, something to pursue, a sense of being needed. That question doesn't interrupt moments like those. It also doesn't come when you're trying hard, when you're pushing yourself to be better, to not fall behind, to become the version others expect. You're occupied with proving that you're on the right path. And in that process, there is no space for questions that feel inconvenient. It doesn't come when you're being praised as doing fine, when others look at you and nod, when everything seems stable, reasonable. You feel temporarily reassured. That recognition, even a small amount, is enough to push the question away. That question only appears when all eyes quietly step back, when no one is judging whether you're right or wrong, when no one is tracking your progress, when no one needs you to become a certain version of yourself, so they can feel at ease. Usually, it comes in very quiet moments. Late at night, when your phone has stopped buzzing. A rare free morning, when no schedule is chasing you. A day when you're alone, and don't have to explain yourself to anyone. And in that stillness, the question appears. Direct, unadorned. If no one were judging, if no one were watching, if there were no one left to please, would you still want this life? Not the life as seen by others, but the life you live every day, when there is no audience. That question doesn't demand an immediate answer. It simply stands there, waiting for you to be honest enough to look at it. I began to realize that many things in my life had been sustained by other people's eyes. I tried because I was recognized, because of praise from my boss, because of a nod that said I was doing things right, because of the feeling of being seen as capable, responsible, valuable. On exhausting workdays that ended with recognition, I somehow found more strength. When my name was mentioned in front of others, or when someone simply said, "You did really well," I felt able to endure more. Not because the work was lighter, but because I felt seen. I kept going because I was told I was right. Right direction. Right path. Right according to what others expected from someone who was doing fine. When people said I was on the right track, I clung to that like a compass. Even when inside I felt uncertain, even bored, I continued. Because at least, I wasn't considered wrong. And sometimes, not being wrong in other people's eyes was enough for me to ignore the feeling of being wrong inside myself. I endured because I was seen as strong. When I didn't complain, they said I was resilient. When I didn't quit, they said I was tough. When I held everything together, they said I was mature. And slowly, I began to tie my worth to my ability to endure. I stayed in situations that were draining me, because I didn't want to be seen as weak. I didn't speak about my exhaustion, because I had grown used to the image of someone who could handle it. I carried more. Not exactly because I wanted to, but because I didn't want to lose that look in other people's eyes. None of this was false. These things once helped me stand. They once gave me motivation. They once kept me from collapsing during difficult times. But they also hid a question that was deeply real and deeply frightening. If those eyes were gone, if there were no more recognition, if no one praised me for being right or strong, what would be left? Would I still want to continue? If no one knew how hard I was trying, would it still feel meaningful? If no one acknowledged how much I was enduring, would I still want this life? If it belonged to no one but me? And only when that question appeared, did I begin to understand this. Living through other people's eyes can take you very far. but it can also leave you not knowing who you are. When no one is watching. Imagine a very quiet day. Not quiet because you're exhausted, but quiet because nothing is pulling you forward. No one knows what you're doing. No one is tracking your progress. No one asks how far you've gone, what you've achieved, or who you're keeping up with. No reminder messages. No waiting eyes. No familiar questions about plans, direction, or the next step. No scoreboard to compare yourself against. No scale to grade yourself on. No praise to cling to. No criticism to avoid. Just you. And the life you're living, whole, unedited. On the morning of that day, when the alarm rings. Not to go anywhere. Not to be on time for anything. Would you still want to wake up? Not because of responsibility. Not because you're afraid of being late. But because you genuinely want to live one more day like this. And throughout that day, when no one is watching, would you still want to continue your current way of living? Or would you suddenly realize that much of your motivation comes from being seen, being acknowledged, being evaluated, being recognized as doing things right, rather than from the act of living itself? That question doesn't force you to answer immediately. It simply stands there. Very still. Very direct. Inviting you to look again. Are you living for the gaze? Or are you living for the experience of being alive? This question is not meant to dismiss your efforts. It doesn't say that what you've done is wrong. It doesn't deny the nights you pushed through, the times you persevered, the seasons when you had to hold yourself together just to stay standing. All of that matters. All of it has value. And it has brought you to where you are today. This question also doesn't say that you're living the wrong life. It doesn't stand in judgment. It doesn't demand immediate change. It simply, gently, removes other people's eyes from your life. To see what remains when you are alone with yourself. When there is no praise to lean on. When there is no scale to compare against. When there are no eyes waiting for you to get it right. Because there are lives that look very beautiful when someone is watching. They have a clear story. Achievements to tell. An image to admire. But when the gaze withdraws. When there is no audience. Those lives can suddenly feel empty. Not because they are wrong. But because they were built too much for the outside. And there are also lives that look very ordinary to others. Not loud. Not remarkable. Not easy to show off. But when you live inside them, you can breathe. You can be present. You can be yourself without having to prove anything. Lives like that may not impress. But they are full in a very quiet way. And this question simply invites you to look again. The life you're living. Is it the kind that needs to be seen? Or the kind you want to be inside of every day? We grow up in a world that is always measuring. From a very early age, we are placed inside systems of evaluation. Grades, rankings, achievements. As we grow older, the metrics change their shape but never disappear. Progress, efficiency, productivity. How we compare to others. We measure outcomes. We measure progress. We measure who is moving faster, who is falling behind. Who is, where, in life. Slowly, we learn to see ourselves through other people's eyes. We decide whether we are doing okay based on external feedback. Are we being praised? Are we being recognized? Are we seen as going in the right direction? If we get a nod of approval, we feel reassured. If we're met with silence, we start to doubt. If we're compared, we feel the need to try harder. And in that process, we rarely ask a very basic question. Am I okay on the inside? Not okay in other people's eyes. But okay after living through a full day, without anyone watching. That is why the question, if no one were judging, feels so uncomfortable. Because it removes all the familiar measuring tools. It doesn't allow you to lean on achievements. It doesn't let you cling to recognition. It doesn't let you hide behind the idea that you're doing things right. It forces you to face your real desire. A desire that hasn't been edited to sound reasonable. Not justified by responsibility. Not polished by familiar explanations. The desire behind the question. How do I truly want to live, when no one is scoring me? Do I still want this for what it is? Or only because it makes me look okay? And because this question doesn't allow you to hide behind other people's gaze. It becomes uncomfortable. But for that very reason. It is also one of the most honest questions you can ask your life. You don't need a beautiful answer to this question. You don't need to be certain. You don't need clarity. You don't need to say something that sounds strong or inspiring. Your answer right now might simply be, I'm not sure. You don't hate the life you're living. But you don't truly want to keep living it this way either. Maybe the answer is not yet. Not yet wanting to wake up every day to the same rhythm. Not yet wanting to keep doing things that slowly drain you, even if they make sense. Maybe the answer is yes, but not like this. You still want to live. You still want to try. But you no longer want to live for the gaze. To prove yourself. To make everything look okay. All of those answers are valid. Because this is not a question meant to grade you. There is no correct answer. There is no model version. What matters is not the answer you give today, but the fact that you dare to ask the question. To dare to look directly at the life you're living. Not through praise. Not through comparison. Not through other people's eyes. To dare to look at an ordinary day and ask, if no one knew what I was doing, if no one recognized it, would I still want to be in this life? Not to judge, but to understand. Because the moment you look at your life, without needing an audience, you begin to touch the most important question of all. Is this life actually mine? And sometimes, simply daring to look in that way is already a very big step on the journey back to yourself. Perhaps, living for yourself begins here. Not by changing everything. Not by making dramatic, decisive moves, starting over from scratch. Not by proving to anyone that you've woken up. But by a very small, very quiet act. You try, just for a moment, to separate other people's gaze from your decision. Not to rebel against anyone. Not to deny responsibility. Just to gently set those gazes down for a while. The gaze of expectation. The gaze of judgment. The gaze that makes you wonder, if I choose differently, what will they think? You set them down. And stay with your own question. In that moment, you don't need to answer to anyone. You don't need to sound reasonable. You don't need to explain. You only need to be honest. To see what remains in you. When no external gaze is guiding the way. What still makes you want to move forward? Even when no one knows. What feels heavy? Even when everyone says you're doing well. What is truly pulling you? From the inside. Not from recognition. And from there, you begin to see something very important. There are things you do because you're afraid that if you don't, you will no longer be seen. And there are things you do because if you stop doing them, you will no longer be yourself. Living for yourself may not begin by changing your life, but by changing what you lean on. From living supported by other people's gaze, to living supported by how it actually feels to be inside this life. So that, slowly, very slowly, you can begin to live not only to be recognized, but because you genuinely want to live. And when you stay with that question long enough, without avoiding it, without rushing to fill the silence, another question begins to take shape. It's no longer a question of who you are. No longer about definitions, roles, or self-image. It becomes a question of the deepest choice. If this life were truly only yours. If no one were judging. If no one needed to nod in approval or feel disappointed. Would you still want to live it this way? Not the okay way. Not the right way. But the way you are living it every day. In the mornings you wake up. The evenings you return home. The quiet moments when no one is watching. Or even deeper. Are you ready to place it differently? Not to overturn everything. Not to throw it all away. But to ask again. What is slowly draining me? What makes me tired without knowing why? What makes me feel alone? Even when I'm surrounded by people. Because very often, we don't change while we still have strength. We only begin to look back when the body is tired. When the mind grows restless. When loneliness appears even inside lives that look full. And perhaps, the fact that you've stopped here at this question is not a sign of weakness. It may be a sign that you've gone far enough in a life that wasn't fully yours to finally feel the cost. This chapter doesn't end with an answer. It ends with honesty. That you can no longer keep living the same way without paying with yourself. And from there, another journey begins. Not a journey to define who you are, but a journey to face what's happening inside. The exhaustion you can't quite name. The anxiety without a clear source. And the loneliness that appears even when you're not alone at all.